Welcome to The World is Watching. We are in Glasgow, Scotland at COP26. That is the Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It is quite a mouthful. And the COP is this big, complex, it's like a machine sometimes, it's like an organism sometimes. It's a really big and complicated, sometimes bureaucratic process. And so we will do our best to pull out some of the most important threads for you. So I'm just going to screen share here. And we just have a couple of slides for you and nothing, try to not make it very technical and keep it as accessible as possible. But if you have any questions and if you want us to slow down or go at a slower pace, please feel free to say so in the chat. And make sure you ask your questions in the Q&A box. All right. So I think it is a bit slow. So this is so COP is a space where governments of the world are gathering to solve this collective problem, this global problem of climate change. And it's also a space where civil society is invited to be a part of that process. And it's not actually that we're invited, we have a right to be a part of that process. And we are actually a critical part of that process. I've actually sort of grown up through these COPs because this was my first entry point into climate politics when about 10 years ago. So this is actually my, I think my 11th year of following these negotiations. And in that time, so the UN Climate Convention is, COP is, it was founded in 1992. So it's just about under 30 years old. And I've been following it for 11 of those years. And in that time, I've seen the COP sort of go from a global collective agreement that was supposed to be strongly legally binding in nature and would hold every country of the world to its fair share of responsibility for reducing emissions. And I've seen a downslide in the last 10 years from a regime that was legally binding, or at least attempting to be legally binding, to then, around the time of the Paris Agreement, switching away from legally binding measures and into a kind of, we call it pledge and review, which is basically where every country makes voluntary pledges about how much they're going to reduce their emissions, with a series of reviews built into that, until the present day now in Glasgow, where we're sort of seeing a COP that half of those pledges haven't been met. And now we're just seeing a COP of announcements, basically. The first week that we were here was the World Leaders Summit. And it was basically heads of state from all over the world gathering here in Glasgow. And there was a whole series of glitzy announcements. And Canada was part of several of those, which Blasi will touch on later. But it's concerning for us who are part of civil society tracking these negotiations, because announcements are not the same as legally binding commitments, and announcements they don't have accountability built into them. And so we don't know, we don't have the trust, and we don't have the track record to know that governments making these announcements are actually going to follow through on them. And unfortunately, what we've been seeing, because today is the last day of COP, what we've been seeing is that what has been announced in these sort of big announcements that have happened over the 2 weeks is not the same as what is being negotiated behind closed doors. And so Canada especially is showing up in a certain way publicly and showing up in a different way behind closed doors. And that's really concerning to us. That's one of our main concerns here. So I'm just gonna take a little step back and show this little graphic just to illustrate maybe visually what is the objective of the COP? Like, why does the world come together every year when we could just be, doing stuff at home, when it could just be Canada taking climate action at home? And the answer to that is that, well, climate change knows no borders, and it is a truly global issue. And it's an issue that we all have different levels of responsibility for as countries of the world. It's an issue that was created historically by the industrialized countries, and the responsibility for the amount of emissions that are in the atmosphere right now, the responsibility for that disproportionately rests with the richest countries in the world, which also happen to be mostly the colonial states, and also happen to be countries that are quite wealthy and more capable of dealing with the impacts of climate change. So at its heart, climate change is an issue of justice and of equity and of burden sharing. So it's not about getting everybody to pitch in equally. It's about what is the best and fair way to share this burden. And unfortunately, what we've seen is that the countries that have the most responsibility for the largest part of that burden are the ones that really don't want to pay their fair share. And so we've seen a real lagging of these talks over the past decade. On to some practical issues at this COP. This COP is the most, it's the strangest one I've ever been to, because there's such limited participation because of what's happening in the world with the pandemic. And I think it's so important to link the situation of vaccine apartheid in the world right now to the issue of climate change. Across the world right now, there's such differing and disparate access to the vaccine, which affected participation at the COP. And it falls along the same fault lines. The places and the countries that don't have access to the vaccine are the same ones that don't always have the most power in these talks, and yet have the most to lose. And so that has created an even greater inequity that we have to mention whenever we talk about the COP, because it plays into the same power dynamics that climate change is all about. So there's a lot of voices missing from the COP. There's a lot of civil society missing. There's a lot of people who couldn't get visas and who couldn't get the vaccine. Because of the equity issues, they had to allow a lot of people who are not vaccinated to attend. And so it's actually problematic in the first place that there was an in-person COP. Luckily, there was no big COVID outbreak or anything like that. That was managed pretty well, but still it was a dicey situation and a public health risk all around. And there was very, very limited civil society participation. And as I mentioned earlier, these are the voices. Civil society is non-government and non-private sector. These are the voices that hold our countries accountable. These are the voices that go back to our countries and support social movements that push our governments on key issues. We are the voices that bring moral clarity to this process. And so without us, it's a very empty process. And another huge issue is that there's a giant fossil fuel lobby present in these talks. And that presence has been growing and growing over the past few years. And it's obviously completely at odds with the goal of this whole COP, which is to limit dangerous emissions that will cause runaway climate change. Okay, so I want to go into a couple just very high level, not diving into very much detail, two of the big sticking point issues at this COP so far that have caused the most tension and that are creating major divides and that are actually delaying the talks. and that are going to sort of set the stage for how we talk about climate in the next year and onwards. So one of these issues, oops, I have a video to show you, but oh no, wait.
Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen.
Stay tuned, that video is actually really good, but I want to talk about something else first. Sorry, guys. 1 second. No. Technical difficulties. We just lost our slides. I would like to play that video for you because it is the president of Barbados who and who brings a real moral clarity to what is very jargony and technical, and so I really want you to hear that, but I'm just going to reshare right before we do that. Okay, so one of these major sticking issues that I was referring to is the idea of net zero. And as many of you may know, Canada has agreed to a broad climate target of net zero emissions by 2050. And there was much made of this agreement. But what we're seeing now in the conversations around net zero is that net zero is a very dangerous framing, and it's a disingenuous framing, and it allows for us to lock in a highly inequitable framework to achieve lower emissions. A framework that many would actually call climate colonialism, because it erases the historical responsibility for climate change, and it relies on projects that largely take place in the global south and largely take place on Indigenous lands and have been linked to human rights abuses and land grabs. And what I mean by that is net zero isn't actually zero. Net zero means that you can continue to emit as long as you have an offset project or a carbon capture project that that offsets ongoing emissions. So it's not real emissions reductions. It's relying on offsets, and it's relying on market-based mechanisms to achieve lower emissions. And so it doesn't actually solve the problem of climate change because, as we said, climate change knows no borders. So
there was a good tweet today that said net zero is the new climate denialism.
Yeah, basically, because it's not, I mean, the slogan at the COP has been net zero is not zero. Not surprisingly, the biggest polluters, both corporate and governmental, are the biggest champions for net zero. And that should be an immediate sort of red flag or sort of like arrow pointing to the fact that this is not a actually effective framing. There's actually not, if you add up all the net zero plans of every corporation and government, there is not actually enough land on Earth to account for all those net zero plans. And what I mean by that is, so for example, in Canada, you know, we could say that we plan to reduce this much emissions and offset this much emissions. And the way those offsets take place is that, you know, maybe it's a tree planting project in Zambia. And so that would be linked to a sort of dubious process of like setting up this tree planting project in a place that is not Canada and would require land in a place that is not Canada, and would require that land to be either taken from someone or not used for other purposes like growing food or whatever it might be. And so all the land that is required for all these net zero projects, the math just doesn't add up. There isn't enough land on Earth. Net zero also relies on a point in the future in which we will magically develop technologies that will help us get to zero emissions. These sophisticated carbon capture technologies that don't exist yet. And so there's another slogan that's been going around at the COP that's stop chasing carbon unicorns, because the whole idea of net zero is sort of chasing this future unicorn of technology that will somehow suck the carbon out of the atmosphere. So many groups who are on the front lines of net zero projects, Indigenous groups, frontline groups mostly in the global south, call it a continued form of colonialism and of continuing to profit off the backs of developing countries. And they sort of talk about net zero as a frame that entrenches power dynamics that have been present in these talks for 3 decades now. The second sort of big sticking point at these talks is this idea of nature-based solutions. And I think if you're following coverage out of these talks, or if you're following climate sort of rhetoric from companies and from governments, you'll hear this term nature-based solutions a lot. If you listen to Stephen Guilbeault, our environment minister, talk from COP26, you would hear him mention nature-based solutions. And it's another one of these framings that is, it's similar to net zero. It contains within it a sort of fundamental contradiction, which is that we can somehow achieve real emissions reductions without addressing the fossil fuel industry, but rather relying on these projects that are market-based usually to achieve emissions reductions. Another red flag is that nature-based solutions are beloved to corporations, to the private sector, and to the biggest climate delaying governments. Another sort of red flag with nature-based solutions is that a lot of these solutions focus away from preserving existing ecosystems and onto sort of relying on technological fixes. So sort of adding technologies into ecosystems that have been damaged by climate change, basically relying on technology rather than on just saying, okay, no, we're not going to log this forest, or we're not going to, put a fish farm in this part of the ocean. And a lot of these nature-based solutions are sort of built under these colonial constructs where they're developed without cooperation with local communities or the indigenous peoples whose land they require. So again, they're a solution that requires more land and therefore sort of deepens those existing divides. Okay, I'm gonna stop talking about all these things now, and I'm gonna let you hear it from the president of Barbados. So we'll just watch 2.5 minutes of this speech. Trust me, it's really good.
Your Royal Highness, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. The pandemic has taught us that national solutions to global problems do not work. We come to Glasgow with global ambition to save our people and to save our planet, but we now find 3 gaps. On mitigation, climate pledges or NDCs. Without more, we will leave the world on a pathway to 2.7 degrees, and with more, we are still likely to get to 2 degrees. These commitments made by some are based on technologies yet to be developed, and this is at best reckless and at worst dangerous. On finance, we are $20 billion short of the $100 billion, and this commitment, even then, might only be met in 2023. On adaptation finance remains only at 25%, not the 50-50 split that was promised nor needed given the warming that is already taking place on this earth. Climate finance to frontline small island developing states declined by 25% in 2019. Failure to provide the critical finance and that of loss and damage is measured, my friends, in lives and livelihoods in our communities. This is immoral, and it is unjust. If Glasgow is to deliver on the promises of Paris, it must close these three gaps. So I ask to you, what must we say to our people living on the front line in the Caribbean, in Africa, in Latin America, in the Pacific, when both ambition and regrettably some of the needed faces at Glasgow are not present? What excuse should we give for the failure? In the words of that Caribbean icon, Eddie Grant, will they mourn us on the front line? When will we, as world leaders across the world, address the pressing issues that are truly causing our people angst and worry, whether it is climate or whether it is vaccines? Simply put, when will leaders lead? Our people are watching, and our people are taking note. And are we really going to leave Scotland without the resolve and the ambition that is sorely needed to save lives and to save our planet? How many more voices and how many more pictures of people must we see on these screens without being able to move? Or are we so blinded and hardened that we can no longer appreciate the cries of humanity?
I'll stop that there, but we'll drop the link in the chat. It's definitely worth a watch. Their whole speech is 8 minutes long, and she really strikes the heart of some of these equity issues that that I mentioned, where it's developing countries that are facing the impacts of climate change first and hardest, who are sort of really begging the rest of the world, and especially the richest industrialized countries, to step up their game. All right, I'm gonna pass it over to Flossie to talk about some of these announcements that Canada has been making. Oh yes. Sorry guys. Sorry guys. Okay, there we go.
Okay, so we just wanted to shift gears a bit and touch just briefly on some of the things that Canada has committed to. You've probably seen in the news, and then because this is the Sierra Club BC webinar, BC's particular contribution. So back at home, you might have seen some flashy headlines. Just a few days into the first week of COP, there was a big announcement around trying to end deforestation by 2030. And on the face of it, this sounds great. We were excited to hear that. But digging into it a little bit more, it's really important to remember the distinction between deforestation and degradation. So deforestation is when a forest is logged and it's kind of turned into something completely different, like farmland. And degradation is when a forest is cut down, or a part of a forest is cut down. It's kind of degraded into a different quality of forest, and it might even be replanted in the form of tree farms, and that's what happens a lot in Canada. And so whilst this commitment to end deforestation by 2030 is maybe really good news for forests in the Congo Basin, it doesn't really change much for old growth forests in Canada. The next big announcement was Canada, along with others, pledged to end international fossil fuel finance, and said that this was the least possible thing Canada could have done whilst avoiding any of their substantive obligations under the Paris Agreement.
Yeah, so this announcement was, I mean, it was welcome, and it was a group, it was a small group of countries, including Canada, that basically said they would end funding for fossil fuel projects abroad, which doesn't mean they're ending funding for fossil fuel projects domestically. And again, the devil is always in the details with these announcements, because the funding actually, the funding for fossil fuel projects abroad is only going to be stopped for a certain class of projects, and those are they're called projects with unabated emissions, which means those are projects that have no offsets attached to them. So just like, you know, a fracking site that is just going to be continuing to emit recklessly for an undetermined amount of time. But to get through this loophole, all a fossil fuel company has to do is, as soon as 2030 hits, just slap an offset project or a carbon capture project onto their existing fossil fuel infrastructure plan, and they can continue emitting. So the announcement is good, and that's it is a step, but it is the barest possible minimum, and it doesn't actually address our huge oil and gas sector in Canada. So definitely something to not applaud too heavily.
And then the final announcement was pledging to put a cap on oil and gas emissions. And again, this sounds great, this sounds hopeful, and it's lacking any legally binding framework. So it's lacking any accountability to actually keep that promise. And without that, we fear that it just sounds like a nice sounding aspiration. It's pretty easy to fall into the kind of mantra that you just hear repeated on the news over and over, which is that some progress is being made, but it's not enough. But quite frankly, you just don't buy it. It's not enough. Canada is not doing enough to protect us, and it's doing the less than minimum that is required.
Google Slides is really giving us a good run for our money.
BC, the darling of climate laggards. So we felt the need to put in a special slide on BC because BC has actually been getting quite a lot of attention internationally for its climate plan. It's won 2 awards since COP began, and is really being kind of celebrated as the pinnacle of what a climate plan could look like. And this is pretty frustrating because just I don't know, a week or two before COP began, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs came out with a letter saying in the strongest terms that they believe that this climate plan is inadequate, and it was backed by, I think, 310 organisations and counting. So civil society and Indigenous leaders in BC roundly came together to denounce that climate plan and said very clearly that it was not in emergency mode. And so for it to come to COP and to kind of be lauded as the pinnacle of what it could be was just, yeah, it was frustrating. What was kind of creepy was that the second award that it won was from an organisation called the Under 2 Coalition, implying that they've already kind of given up on that 1.5 target. So earlier this week, we held an action inside COP, and it was just a little stunt to try and get media attention, really. Getting the media to see that there was international opposition to BC's climate plan because of this huge LNG-shaped hole in it, because of the continual support of fracked gas in the province. And so we don't have a picture of it at the beginning, but we had a large piece of red velvet curtain and a friend who is an actress, and we hosted our own fake award ceremony for BC's climate plan, and she really hummed it up. And we had speakers, and we caught the attention of tons of people just outside the COP cafeteria and managed to get that story into quite a lot of different news outlets.
Oh, I should mention with that action, what was really cool about it is that we linked up with a group in Japan called Friends of the Earth Japan, and they actually have an active campaign to stop LNG in BC because it gets shipped over to them. And LNG projects in BC are actually funded by a public Japanese bank. So it's Japanese taxpayers' money going towards funding LNG projects in BC. And so there was this really cool international cooperative solidarity moment where they joined us and they spoke at our action, and they actually have a demand letter that's been signed by 93 organizations from 30 countries specifically about LNG in BC. So we were able to show up to COP and say there's international opposition to how you're supporting this industry in BC.
Yes, and if you are on this call and you are a member of an organization that hasn't signed on with those other 310 organizations yet calling for a more fitting climate plan for the climate emergency, then Maya will put that link in the chat, and please go and get your organization to sign on to it. Okay, we're going to switch gears again. That was a huge amount of information. I promise that that's really kind of the last of the jargon, but it's hard because COP is just this giant white noise machine, and there's a lot of hot air and there's a lot of these kind of false solutions that are difficult to understand being created around. And we know that to really get to the heart of the climate crisis and the healing that needs to happen, we need to be following and learning from Indigenous-led solutions and other practices.
Yeah, so as Plessy mentioned, there's a lot of different, there's a lot of false solutions flying around the COP. We mentioned a couple of them, net zero and nature-based solutions. And so we wanted to focus on one true solution. And we know that in order to actually tackle the logic of extractivism that is so prevalent in these talks, I mean, there's literally a huge fossil fuel lobby in these talks. We need to focus on actual Indigenous-based solutions, which involve largely giving land back to Indigenous people and incorporating land stewardship practices that Indigenous people have practiced for time immemorial. And so that's why the land back movement that is building momentum and growing across Turtle Island to us really captures the heart of climate justice, because it brings in a logic that is the opposite of extraction-based neoliberal colonial logic, and that caused the climate crisis in the first place. And so one cool way that this is happening in BC is through Indigenous rights and title cases. And we've had several of these landmark cases in BC, all the way from Delgamuukw in 1997 to the historic Chilcotin case I believe that was completed in 2012. And we actually, part of our role at this COP was to support one such case that's happening right now that we believe is really significant and important. And it's being taken by the Nuchatlaht Nation, which is on the northwest part of Vancouver Island. Their traditional homelands are on what is now known as Nootka Island. And they are, for the past 4 years, I believe, they've been engaged in a historic rights and title case against the BC government. So it's one little nation of like 160 people against the BC government. And so we were lucky enough to travel here with the Tai Hatwit, which is the high chief of that nation here. He came all the way to Glasgow, and we brought that story to the world stage here and did a presentation on their precedent-setting case. So this case will go into court on in March 14th in Vancouver. So whoever here happens to be in Vancouver, we will have a bunch of ways to engage and to sort of build public support around that really important case. So we want to play a little video for you just to introduce this case and just to put it in context and to sort of show why it's so important that land goes back to Indigenous peoples. And Maya, I'm hoping you can share that video. It's just 2 minutes. I think Maya's about to share it. And it's a really inspiring story. So if the video doesn't work for any reason, we really encourage you to go and check it out on their Facebook page.
Growing up in Nuchatlaht was it was the best world that I know of. Growing up, had everything that we needed.
Every morning we'd go to the beach to harvest sea urchins, abalone, mussels.
We'd all eat together and it was always so much fun. Those were the best days of my life, being out in Nuchatlaht.
When the non-Aboriginal people hit our shores, they seen the wealth of the ocean, they seen the wealth of the land, but their wealth was personal gain.
I see them logging all around us and I don't see anybody asking permission.
When a logging company comes in, they log and they leave, and it looks like a bomb went off.
It's all connected. The fish, the forest, we've depleted them to an extent where we need to look after it. We need to set aside something.
We've never relinquished Nuchatlaht, so we truly believe it's ours yet.
We're not just fighting for Nuchatlaht. We want to show the world that we can manage better, protect better, and we can enhance better. And there'll be enough for everybody.
Nuchatlaht was a paradise. I think it can be that way again, and I want the world to be able to come and visit Nuchatlaht to see the beauty and just want it back.
Everybody will know about Nuchatlaht, this tiny little community that's taking on the province, Canada, and the logging companies. We're 180 strong, and we will win.
So donations are still sorely needed for this very expensive court case that's in its final few months. So we sort of brought the story of the Nuchatlaht to COP, and on the left, in the blue vest, is Tai Hatwit Jordan Michael, who is from an unbroken line of hereditary chiefs that is 12,000 years long. And his ancestor was the first person to greet Captain Cook when he landed on the shores of Nootka Island. And so it's a really powerful and sort of poetic full circle moment that after they welcomed Captain Cook and the colonizers to their homelands so many years ago, now they are going to court to take back their lands. So we also have Carissa Glendale in the Haida vest, who works with Sierra Club BC with us, and in the middle, that's Mark Worthing, our senior coastal projects lead. And on the right is Jack Woodward, who is the lead lawyer in this lawsuit against the BC government. So, yeah, as we said, so Maya has dropped a link where you can support this title case, and you'll be hearing a lot more from us about this in the next couple of months.
Yeah, and in case it wasn't obvious from that video, if then Nuchatlaht win this case, then they have this incredible vision for stewarding their territory called salmon parks, and it's so exciting because under a salmon park idea, every decision in an entire watershed must be made for the sole benefit of wild salmon. And so when you start making decisions that benefit wild salmon, you start making decisions differently about forest management and so on and so forth. And so it's really the kind of transformational watershed approach that we so desperately need.
Yeah, so we actually had, we wanted to have, on our original webinar date, we wanted to have Chief Jordan on the webinar. Unfortunately, because of our cancellation, he couldn't be here with us today, but you'll hear from him through us pretty soon. So we want to close, we might not have time to get to a lot of questions, but we want to close with a couple of ways that you can get involved right now. Just a quick bottom line, just to return back to here, Glasgow, COP26. The goal is to get to 1.5, and 1.5 is the maximum level of warming that the world has agreed to. 1.5 is a political figure, it's not a scientific figure, it's actually way higher than many frontline communities would have liked, but that is the global target. And so every action, every commitment, every announcement that Canada makes and that BC makes has to be in line with that 1.5 degree target. Otherwise, it's not real. And so that's why we call out solutions like net zero and nature-based solutions, because when you dig in and you ask the right questions, they don't add up to 1.5. And so that's our sort of guiding star as we move forward from COP26. The negotiations are ongoing right now, and they will likely be going until late Saturday night. We have a draft text on the table, and that text unfortunately falls far short of the 1.5 target, and it enshrines some of the harmful solutions that we've talked about, like carbon markets. And so we want to be able to have a voice while our government is at COP, and we want to hold them accountable when they return from COP. So there's a couple of things that you can do that Les is going to walk you through. Oh, I'll get to that.
So next week, we expect to see a lot of hubris in the media about Canada being back on the stage as the climate leader, and we just want to pass on the fact that, well, that is not true, and the strategy here, that the best strategy that we can think of right now is to disrupt that narrative, and just do that in whatever way feels best for you. Maybe you want to make a TikTok video. Maybe you want to write a letter to the editor. Maybe you want to call your MP or your MLA and leave a message. Maybe you want to shoot a short video on your cell phone and post it on social media. This is a draft script that we threw together shortly before this. We would gladly work with you one-on-one to make it more personal for the situation that you're in. But really disrupt. As soon as inevitably your friends, your colleagues will say, well, have you heard about COP? What do you think of COP? Your task is to say net zero is bullshit. That zero is not a climate solution, and point people towards the Nuchatlaht title case and fundraising for that. Yeah, and as I said, my colleague and our colleagues at the CEU would love to support you in like helping to make a video or write that that letter to the editor if you wish. And if you do that, please also send a copy to your MP or your MLA. It's really important that they see that you are out there being public in this moment when the media will really try and paint Canada and BC as a climate hero.
Right. And I think that just gives us a few minutes for questions. As Maya mentioned in the chat, we will be sending out those talking points and actions in a follow-up email. So if you registered for the webinar, you'll get that email. So I'm just looking at the questions here. Ole asks, doesn't a cap on oil and gas emissions mean that GHG emissions from fossil fuel burning can continue up to some maximum rate indefinitely? Am I missing something? So Canada's big announcement about the cap on oil and gas emissions is a little disingenuous because, first of all, it's not really a cap because it only applies to certain types of emissions, and it excludes a certain class of emissions that by some calculations amounts to 75 to 95% of emissions. So actually there's a really, really big loophole there in which fossil fuel companies can just continue emitting. Yeah, so no, you're not missing something. That the cap was not really a cap, and it doesn't even come into effect until 2030. So basically fossil fuel companies can do whatever they want for the next 9 years unabated. All right. Thank you for organizing and gathering us. It strikes me that now, upon the vile failure of COP26 and the federal government, it's now the duty of and moment for mass dissent by the Canadian citizenry. What are your thoughts? What must we do? How do we shut down colonial modernity now? Do you want to take a crack at that?
Donate to the Nuchatlaht title case. Mark March 14th in your calendar. That's the date of their court hearing, and we'll be, as Ange said, organising a lot of support in the lead up to that.
Yeah, you know, I came into these talks sort of very pessimistic. Not pessimistic, but you know, I was feeling a little dark because, as I mentioned, this is my 11th year following these negotiations, and I've sort of seen the erosion of some of the actually strong structures within the agreement. I've seen it go from being a substantial agreement to being something that's just sort of for press and accolades and media and has no teeth whatsoever. And so, you know, part of me was like, oh, you know, we've already lost, or we've lost so much, or we've locked in this much warming. However, there's another wave that's coming from the other direction, and that is that social movements around the world have transformed in the last few years around the issue of climate. The youth presence at the COP was just absolutely phenomenal, and the youth are not taking any bullshit. You know, Greta Thunberg's speech about blah blah blah, it was rude and shocking, and you know, rubbed people the wrong way. And I think that's the point. I think the point is to jam the gears of the colonial logic that got us here in the first place. And that's the only way we're actually going to get into emergency mode. So absolutely, it's the time for dissent, but it's also the time for organizing. We have to take this into our own hands, and we have to organize in the networks that we belong to, and we have to get the networks that we belong to into emergency gear. So more on that to come, but yes, absolutely, it is the age of dissent, and that's the one thing that's really giving me hope.
And we talk about emergency mode as kind of being both and. It's both, as Ange said, really doubling down on organizing, and in many ways it's also slowing down, or at least for a lot of settlers, trying to get out of their heads, being outside more, trying to go slower, to learn to see differently, to try and slowly rebuild a different kind of relationship with the land. And I found anyway that that's actually very slow and patient work, and it's hard to do that if you're constantly frantic pushing mode. And so to somehow we have to figure out how to do both. There's a beautiful quote by a education professor at UBC, and she talks about to be in emergency mode is to kind of be in this convergence of two circles. So one circle is kind of a world in which so many of its systems are crumbling, they have to crumble, it's hospicing that world. And then there's also the circle of midwifing the new one that is coming, that's emerging. And right now we have to stand in the middle of both of them, and that's scary and it's hard and it's terrifying, and it's also beautiful and it's transformative. And this is where we absolutely need to be.
Yeah, climate change is an inside and an outside job. You know, we can't organize, and we can't show up in the best way and bringing our best selves to social movements and to the networks that we belong to unless we are good on the inside and we've challenged where colonial extractivist logic lives in us. And so it's this sort of fractal thing, so within, so without. All right, there's a question asking if we can send all the links, and yes, our wonderful Maya will send out all the links in a follow-up email. Lori says that stopping deforestation and afforestation is not a way to make a difference in saving our planet. We have to stop any further oil, gas, and coal projects. I totally agree. And someone else asked, should activists run for office? And my answer is yes, activists should run for office. And we absolutely need to make that happen. And I would support any activist who actually arises from social movements and who's actually been fighting these issues in a venue that's not electoral politics to step into electoral politics. I learned a lot from my experience doing so. Donating to the Indigenous voices that are doing their best to hold the voices for this issue and much more. Absolutely, and I think especially in BC, we have, across Turtle Island, we have these extremely vibrant Indigenous-led movements, and it's Indigenous people who are holding the burden and the pain and the responsibility of fighting against this large sort of inertia running system that has created the climate crisis. And so those Indigenous frontline leaders need the support in various forms. And so that's why right now we're directing money towards the Nuchatlaht legal case. But I think there are so many places to support Indigenous voices. I think that's it. Thank you so much for your questions.
Thank you everyone. Remember to disrupt the message in the coming days and weeks. And yeah, please be in touch if you need any support with that. We would love to help you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being interested.
Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll do some follow-ups after the COP as well. So try to explain a lot of these issues in a simple and easy to follow way, because we all deserve to know and we all deserve to be part of the process. Yeah, so thanks so much for joining us, and we will talk to you very soon.